Before we begin, what you're about to hear is a true story. 4 real people lost their lives, and their families are still living with that loss today. We cover this case with the respect every one of them deserves. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. Every year, millions of people hike America's national forests. Unfortunately, some people go there with very bad intentions. Between October 2007 and January 2008, a green Chevrolet Astro van moved through the national forests of North Carolina, Florida, and Georgia. The man driving it carried a golden retriever, high-end hiking gear, and a method he had spent years perfecting. He approached lone hikers on remote trails, took their ATM cards, kept them alive long enough to drain their accounts, and disappeared back into the trees before anyone could even notice the disappearance. Across 3 states, across 3 national forests, 4 people died in the span of just 90 days. Not a single law enforcement jurisdiction in any of those 3 states knew the others were working the same case, because to each of them, it looked like a different case entirely. The pattern was sitting there the whole time, visible to anyone drawing lines on a map. But nobody could draw the lines until it became too late. On New Year's Day, 2008, on Blood Mountain, Georgia, the hikers moving through it pay attention to the mountain the way hikers do, watching the ground, watching the sky, nodding at strangers in that easy way you do when you share a trail with someone. Most of them notice a young woman in the green jacket first, her black Labrador pulling slightly ahead on the leash, nose reading the frozen ground like a map. Then they notice a man behind her, somewhere in his late 50s or 60s, wearing high-end hiking gear, a police-style baton and a bayonet knife on his belt, and on his shoes, carefully applied strips of duct tape. One hiker watches him pass and cannot shake the detail. Later, he will tell investigators, somebody is a very experienced hiker. Nobody on that trail understood what they were looking at. Nobody knew the woman in the green jacket was going to be the 4th victim of this deadly killer. In April 2025, inside a Florida state prison, Gary Michael Hilton, 78 years old, sits across from court TV reporter David Scott for his first televised interview. He has been convicted of 4 murders across 3 states. He has been sentenced to death in Florida for the killing of a 46-year-old Sunday school teacher named Cheryl Hodges Dunlap, a murder he has never once addressed on camera, even as his appeal works its way through the courts. Scott tells him, "You've never publicly said what happened." Hilton considers that for a moment, then leans forward and says this, "No, I haven't, and that case, currently, is under appeal. It hasn't been finally adjudicated, but hey, I'm gonna give you a new scoop. I did it. So, there you have it. I'm confessing to her murder on camera that I never have before, and I'll be glad to tell anyone I did." He is not agitated, not remorseful, not performing contrition for the camera, or calculating what the confession might cost him legally. He delivers it the way a man might announce he fixed a leaky pipe, as a settled fact, nothing remarkable about it, something he has always known and simply decided today was the day to say out loud. Then he describes Cheryl Dunlap, the woman he kidnapped, held captive, and killed in a national forest in 2007, like this. She was a devout Christian and a real wheel in the church. A real wheel in the church. Not what he did to her, what she was in the world before he found her, summarized in 9 words, filed away, dispensed with. The casual familiarity of a man who processed Cheryl Dunlap the way you process something you briefly encountered and moved on from. He is already convicted, already sentenced to die. The confession changed nothing in any courtroom. He gave it anyway, like a man with nothing left to protect and no particular reason to stay quiet anymore. To understand why that sentence, a real wheel in the church, is the most revealing thing about this entire case, we have to go back. Back to the van, back to the forests, back to the people who walked into them and never came out. Before we get into everything, if you're new here, this is Shadow Verdict. We cover cases like this one, cases where the system failed, where people were forgotten, and where the full story never quite made it to the headlines. If that sounds like something you want more of, hit subscribe. It's free, and I promise every video is worth your time. Now, let's get back to the man in the van. To understand Gary Michael Hilton, you start with the van, a 2001 Chevrolet Astro, green, with the rear seat removed and the interior converted into a mobile survival base, stocked with weapons, gear, and the kind of supplies a man needs when he has decided the road is his permanent address and the forest is his office. He drove it through Georgia, Florida, and North Carolina with a golden retriever named Dandy riding in the back. And when he pulled into a trailhead parking area and climbed out in his high-end hiking gear, he looked exactly like what the forests attract by the millions. An eccentric outdoor enthusiast, harmless, maybe a little odd, completely unremarkable. Born on November 22nd, 1946, in Atlanta, Georgia, Hilton spent most of his life accumulating minor damage and leaving minor traces. At 13 years old, he shot and injured his stepfather, documented on record, one early signal of a capacity for violence that would take decades to fully surface. He joined the Army in his 20s, trained as a paratrooper, experienced a psychiatric episode, and received an honorable discharge in 1967. 3 marriages followed, and 3 divorces. A long trail of minor criminal arrests, drunk driving, weapons charges, drug possession, 21 counts of solicitation. Nothing that would make a national database flag him as the kind of man who drives between national forest hunting people. He worked as a handyman sometimes, drifted always, kept moving. The method he developed was specific and deliberate. He chose national forests because they are vast and remote, because the people in them are alone and trusting, and because the jurisdictions responsible for policing them rarely communicate across state lines. He chose hikers because they carry ATM cards, and because a man with a friendly dog asking for directions looks like exactly what he pretends to be. He would approach his targets casually, escalate to a weapon before they understood what was happening, force them into the van, and keep them alive for as long as it took to drain their bank accounts. When the money ran out, or when they gave him the wrong pin, he killed them. Then he drove to the next forest and started again. The trail was the trap, every single time. Criminal profilers from the FBI and agencies across the country attended his trials and said publicly what the pattern suggested. They did not believe Gary Hilton began killing in the 60s. Criminologist Eric Hickey stated that Hilton was likely responsible for homicides predating 2007 by years, possibly decades. The forests he moved through held older secrets, and some of those secrets may never surface. But between October 2007 and January 2008, within a span of less than 90 days, Gary Hilton moved through 3 states and left 4 confirmed people dead. The same van, the same dog, the same method, 3 separate law enforcement jurisdictions, and not one of them knew the other cases existed, until Blood Mountain forced the connection that should have already been made. On the morning of October 21st, 2007, in the cool early air of the North Carolina mountains, Jack Davis Bryant and Irene Woods Bryant parked their maroon Ford Escape at Yellow Gap Road near U.S. Route 276, locked the doors, and started up into Pisgah National Forest. Jack was 80 years old. Irene was 84. They lived in Horseshoe, North Carolina, and they have been hiking these mountains for decades. Not occasionally, not as tourists, but as people for whom the trails were as familiar and trustworthy as anything in their lives. 164 years of combined living, and a significant portion of it spent exactly like this, together on a mountain in the cold morning air, doing the thing they loved. According to Hilton's own admissions in his North Carolina plea, he had made friends with them before the attack. He had bided his time, which means Jack and Irene Bryant did what every experienced hiker does when they meet a friendly stranger with a dog on a familiar trail. They were kind to him. They had no reason not to be. The trail was a trap. Hilton killed Irene Bryant where she stood, with a blunt instrument and with such force that when investigators found her body on November 10th, she cannot be physically identified. Her right forearm had been severed. Jack Bryant he took, kept him alive, moving him through the back roads in that green van while demanding his PIN number, running the card, failing, trying again. Jack Bryant was 80 years old. Hilton held him for days before shooting him once in the head with a .22 Magnum and leaving his body in the forest. A hunter found Jack Bryant's skull in February 2008, 16 miles away in Nantahala National Forest. For 2 full weeks after October 21st, the maroon Ford Escape sat in the Yellow Gap Road parking area, patient, ordinary, and completely wrong. Their family heard nothing and eventually reported them missing to the Henderson County Sheriff's Office, which launched a search with 30 volunteers, cadaver dogs, and a helicopter. The case stayed in Henderson County, North Carolina. 1 jurisdiction, 1 forest, 1 investigation with no reason yet to look south toward Florida or east toward Georgia. 2 people who had trusted these mountains their entire lives, who had been kind to a stranger with a dog on a familiar trail. A car waiting in a parking lot for people who would never come back to it. 6 weeks after the Bryants disappeared in North Carolina, on a quiet Saturday afternoon in early December, Cheryl Hodges Dunlap drove to the Leon Sinks geological area in Florida's Apalachicola National Forest and parked her car. She was 46 years old, a mother of 2, and a Sunday school teacher at her church in Tallahassee, someone whose presence was so reliable that her congregation built its rhythms around her. On December 1st, she brought a book into the forest and found somewhere quiet to read. A woman alone in a beautiful place with an afternoon to herself and a book in her hands. That is the last documented ordinary moment of Cheryl Dunlap's life, and it is worth holding on to, because everything the public record gives us after that moment belongs to what Gary Hilton did, and that is not the same thing as who Cheryl Dunlap was. Hilton was already working the area. He took her. According to the court record, she was held captive for somewhere between 2 days and a week, long enough that traces of her blood appeared on multiple items later recovered from his van, long enough for the Florida Supreme Court to find that the evidence supported her having suffered fear and emotional strain in the time leading up to her death. On December 15th, a hiker named Ronnie Rentz and his dogs came upon her remains in Apalachicola National Forest. She had been decapitated and dismembered. On December 3rd, 2 days after she disappeared into that forest, Cheryl Dunlap's church noticed she hadn't come to teach Sunday school. Her congregation felt her absence before any missing persons report existed. Her family filed one the following day. Leon County classified her death as an isolated homicide and worked it as a standalone Florida case, even as quiet questions had begun circulating between investigators in Georgia and Florida about a man with a van and a dog moving between the 2 states. 17 years later, from a prison cell in Florida, Gary Hilton would describe her like this: "She was a devout Christian and a real wheel in the church. Not what he did to her in that forest. What she was in her community, delivered in the same flat tone a man might use to summarize a co-worker he barely knew. She went to the forest to read, alone, on a December afternoon, with a book and some quiet. That image is the last thing the record gives us of Cheryl Dunlap on her own terms, and is the image this story owes her. Meredith Hope Emerson was 24 years old, an honors graduate of the University of Georgia, with a degree in French, a semester abroad in France behind her that her parents David and Susan later described as having made a wonderfully positive impression on her and changed her life. She held a blue belt in Aikido and trained seriously. Her friend Robbie Poyster remembered her with a precision that says everything. She couldn't stand to see pain on anyone's face, not in a sentimental way, but in the way of someone who does something about it. Green was her favorite color. At 24, she lived in Beaufort, Georgia, and had been training Ella, a black Labrador retriever, as a physical therapy dog. They had logged miles together on Georgia's trails, and Blood Mountain was familiar ground. On New Year's Day 2008, she parked her 1995 Chevrolet Cavalier at the Byron Herbert Reach trailhead, clipped Ella's leash, pulled on her green jacket, and started up into the cold morning air. Hilton was already on the mountain. He approached her, produced a knife, and demanded her ATM card. What happened next surprised him. Meredith Emerson fought back. Her Aikido training, her physical conditioning, her absolute refusal to simply comply. He later told investigators she wouldn't stop fighting, wouldn't stop yelling, and he needed to both control her and silence her at the same time. When she finally fought him to a point where he said it broke his own hand, he forced her into the van and drove. She gave him the wrong pin. Every time Hilton ran her card, the transaction failed. So he kept her, moving through back roads and forest pull-offs for 4 days while the search for her spread across 90 square miles of Chattahoochee National Forest. While her friends posted flyers, and witnesses from Blood Mountain came forward with descriptions of the man with duct tape on his shoes. On January 3rd, authorities found her Cavalier at the trailhead, water bottle inside, a dog leash, a police baton. On January 4th, Ella turned up alive in a Kroger parking lot in Cumming, Georgia, 60 miles from the mountain, wandering alone and unhurt. The dog came back. Meredith did not. On January 4th, at a Chevron station in DeKalb County, a witness called police with 3 words. The guy you are looking for is cleaning out his van. Officers arrived before Hilton could bleach the interior. The rear seat belt missing from the van matched one found among Meredith's belongings in a dumpster near Quick Trip. Her blood was on a claw hammer recovered from inside. Her identification, her clothing. Hilton was arrested, charged, and transferred to federal custody, and Meredith Hope Emerson was still somewhere in the forest. By the time Gary Hilton was sitting in federal custody in Atlanta in January 2008, 3 separate law enforcement jurisdictions had been working 3 separate cases for 3 months, and none of them had yet drawn a single connecting line between what happened in North Carolina in October, what happened in Florida in December, and what was now unfolding in Georgia in January. When Henderson County launched its search for Jack and Irene Bryant in late October 2007, the investigators working that case had no reason to look south. They were working a missing persons case in a North Carolina forest. That was the whole job. 6 weeks later, when Leon County began working Cheryl Dunlap's disappearance in Florida, their investigators had no reason to look north or east toward Georgia, where nothing had happened yet. Each jurisdiction was doing exactly what it was built to do, working the case in front of it, inside its own boundaries, with its own resources. That is not negligence. That is the architecture. And the architecture had no room in it for a man who treated state lines as irrelevant, who moved between jurisdictions the way the forests themselves move, without asking permission, without leaving a forwarding address, without any awareness that the lines on a map were supposed to contain him. 3 national forests, 3 states, 3 investigations that were never designed to be one. How long does a pattern have to repeat before it becomes a pattern someone officially recognizes? What broke the case open was not better coordination or a database match or a tip from another jurisdiction. It was the scale of public attention that surrounded Meredith Emerson's disappearance. Witnesses who came forward within hours, friends who mobilized before the first day ended, media coverage that arrived fast and stayed, the FBI and GBI both deploying resources across 90 square miles of Chattahoochee National Forest within days. That level of response had never materialized for Jack and Irene Bryant, whose maroon Ford Escape sat in a parking lot for 2 weeks before their family even reported them missing. It had never materialized for Cheryl Dunlap, whose church noticed she was gone before law enforcement treated her disappearance as anything beyond an isolated Florida homicide. A Sunday school congregation felt the absence before any detective did. That is the honest summary of where the system stood in December 2007. Once Hilton was in custody and investigators began laying the cases side by side, the van, the dog, the gear, the decapitation, the ATM pattern, the forests, the connection assembled itself almost immediately. The same man, 3 states, always moving, always invisible, until Meredith Emerson's disappearance finally generated enough pressure to catch him mid-cleanup at a gas station. But Meredith's body was still out there. Her family needed to know where she was. They needed to bring her home. Hilton made an offer from custody. He would lead investigators to her body in exchange for 2 things: the death penalty taken off the table in Georgia, and his dog Dandy safely rehomed with someone who would care for her. Those were his terms, not his freedom, not a reduced sentence beyond what the agreement specified. The needle off the table, and the dog looked after. Prosecutors agreed. Investigators agreed. A deliberate, documented, irreversible decision. And it is worth sitting with what that decision actually was. On one side, a death sentence for a man who had kidnapped and killed 4 people across 3 states. On the other, the location of a young woman's body and a family's ability to bury their daughter. Both things real, both things true, both sitting in the same room simultaneously without resolving each other. Hilton honored the agreement. He led investigators into the Dawson Forest Management area, stopped at a specific point in the trees, and pointed. Meredith Hope Emerson had been under leaves and brush since January 7th. Later, in court, in statements to investigators, and again in his 2025 television interview, Gary Hilton described those 4 days in the van with Meredith Emerson. His exact words, delivered with the same absence of weight he brings to everything he says about the people he killed. It was hard. You gotta remember we had spent several good days together. Several good days. 4 days in a van. A 24-year-old woman deliberately feeding him wrong PIN numbers, fighting to stay alive long enough for someone to find her. A woman trained in Aikido, trained to ease other people's pain, who fought him hard enough on that mountain that he said it broke his own hand. That is what he called those 4 days. Several good days together. The forests he had moved through, Georgia, Florida, North Carolina, and possibly further back than anyone has been able to prove, finally had a name attached to them. Gary Michael Hilton, the man with the van and the dog and the duct tape on his shoes, who had stood on a trail and looked like someone who belonged there, because he had spent years making sure he did. In Georgia, the legal process moved with unusual speed. On January 30th, 2008, less than 4 weeks after his arrest, Gary Hilton stood in a Georgia courtroom and pleaded guilty to the murder of Meredith Emerson, honoring the agreement that had led investigators to the Dawson Forest Management area. The sentence was life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 30 years, and it came down as one of the swiftest resolutions in Georgia murder case history. Florida took considerably longer. Hilton fought extradition from Georgia, lost, and was brought to Leon County in 2010 to stand trial for the murder of Cheryl Dunlap. He pleaded not guilty and forced the state to build its case from the ground up. The forensic evidence, the blood traces on his belongings, and the video footage recovered from his van that showed him disposing of Cheryl Dunlap's body while singing. After 4 hours of deliberation, The jury convicted him on 3 of 4 charges and voted unanimously to recommend death. On February 22, 2011, the court followed that recommendation, finding 6 aggravating factors. In 2021, after Hilton attempted to overturn the sentence by claiming ineffective counsel, the Florida Supreme Court upheld it. North Carolina came last. In March 2012, Hilton admitted to the kidnapping and murders of Jack and Irene Bryant and received 4 consecutive life sentences without the possibility of parole, 1 for each count, running end to end, for 2 people who had parked their car at Yellow Gap Road on an ordinary Tuesday, been kind to a stranger with a dog, and trusted the mountain the way they always had. While the legal proceedings moved through their years, something quieter happened in the Georgia legislature. A reporter had filed an open records request for Meredith Emerson's crime scene and autopsy photographs. Her family fought it, and in March 2010, the Georgia House Governmental Affairs Committee passed House Bill 1322 unanimously, the Meredith Emerson Memorial Privacy Act, preventing crime scene photos from being publicly released or disseminated. Every crime victim in Georgia carries some protection today because a 24-year-old woman's family refused to let her worst moments become public property and then walked into the legislature and made that refusal into law. Her name is on a law that outlives her. Then came April 2025, death row, congestive heart failure, an appeal still technically moving through the courts, and Gary Hilton chose to sit across from a camera and confess to a murder he had already been convicted of, in a case that had already sentenced him to die, simply because a reporter asked, and he decided today was the day. Already convicted, already sentenced. The confession cost him nothing and changed nothing, and he delivered it with exactly that much weight. Meredith Hope Emerson died at 24 years old, and her name is attached to 3 things that will outlive everyone in this story. At the University of Georgia, the Meredith Hope Emerson Memorial Award for Study Abroad was created by the faculty and students who loved her in honor of the semester in France that her parents described as having made a wonderfully positive impression on her and changed her life. A French degree, a blue belt, a dog she was training to ease the pain of strangers, all of it threaded back to the person she had been building herself into at 24. The Right to Hike initiative was established by her friends in her memory, promoting anti-abduction education and hiker safety workshops across the country. Built from grief, aimed outward towards strangers on trails she would never walk again. And the Meredith Emerson Memorial Privacy Act, because when a reporter filed for her crime scene photographs, her family said no, and then made sure that no became permanent for every victim in Georgia who came after her. On the day of her memorial at Central Presbyterian Church in Atlanta, 600 people came, and every one of them wore green, her favorite color, the one thing her family asked. Outside in the garden, Ella waited. The dog she had spent months training to ease the pain of strangers sat in the cold, while 600 people in green said goodbye to the person who had trained her. Family spokeswoman Peggy Bailey told CNN that Ella was a part of Meredith that they would always have. In the margins of this case, for other names appear Judy Smith, Jason Knapp, Rosanna Miliani, Michael Scott Lewis, and it is important to say clearly what they are and what they are not. They are suspected victims of Gary Hilton. They are not confirmed. He has never been charged in connection with any of their deaths. Their cases remain open. Judy Smith's bones were found in Pisgah National Forest in 1997, near where Hilton would later leave another victim. Jason Knapp, a 20-year-old Clemson University student, disappeared in 1998 and was eventually declared legally dead, his car found at Table Rock State Park. Rosanna Miliani, 26 years old, vanished from the Appalachian Trail in 2005, and a store clerk later told investigators she believed she had seen Miliani with a man matching Hilton's description before she disappeared. Michael Scott Lewis, 27 years old, was found dismembered in Florida's Tomoka River in November 2007, packed in black bags. His head never recovered. Their families have no verdict, no agreement, no investigator led to a specific location in a specific forest. They live in the space between confirmed and unknown. And that space carries a human cost that no conviction in this case has ever touched. In the years following Gary Hilton's convictions, the National Park Service and FBI implemented improved trail monitoring and increased ranger patrols across the National Forest System, and cross-jurisdictional coordination protocols between state law enforcement became a documented focus of post-case reform. The structural gaps that allowed one man to move through 3 forests and 3 separate investigations were examined, and some of them were addressed. The trail was the trap. That has not changed. National forests are still vast and still beautiful, and a man with a van and a dog on a hiking trail still looks exactly like what Gary Hilton spent years making himself look like. The Bryants parked their maroon Ford Escape at Yellow Gap Road in October 2007, and nobody connected their disappearance to Cheryl Dunlap's in December, and nobody connected either of them to the man on Blood Mountain in January, until Meredith Emerson's disappearance finally generated enough public attention to make the pattern impossible to ignore, by which point 4 people were already gone, 2 life sentences, a death row conviction, a Privacy Act named after a 24-year-old woman who loved the color green. Is it enough? That question does not resolve, and it should not, and it will not. Not while 4 other names sit in the margins of a case file marked suspected and unconfirmed. Not while the forests are still vast. Not while the honest answer to how does one man stay invisible across 3 states and 3 investigations is still. Because the system was not built to see him. In April 2025, from a prison cell in Florida, Gary Hilton offered his final words on Meredith Emerson, the last person he killed, the one whose disappearance finally ended his movement through the forests. It was hard. You gotta remember we had spent several good days together. That is the last time his voice appears in this story. He is still alive. They are not. Meredith, Cheryl, Jack, Irene, that's why we're here. If this case stayed with you, subscribe to Shadow Verdict. Every video on this channel exists for the same reason this one does. The forgotten deserve to be remembered.